Welcome to the Recharge Zone podcast. This is the first episode of the official podcast for the Edwards Aquifer Authority, also known as the EAA. I'm your host, Ann-Margaret Gonzalez. I serve as a communications specialist at the EAA. I'm the behind-the-scenes communicator working to carefully craft easy-to-digest messages for our community. From social media posts, media relations, press releases, and beyond, communication is my realm of choice. I'm joined today by my co-host, Brent Doty, research manager for the EAA. I'll let you take it from here, Brent.
Hi, everyone. I'm your co-host, Brent Doty. As Ann-Margaret mentioned, I'm the research manager here at the Edwards Aquifer Authority. I help organize and direct many of our aquifer science efforts to further our understanding of the system, enabling our stakeholders and policymakers to access the most important and up-to-date information. As a geologist, this aquifer never ceases to amaze me, and I love trying every day to learn more about it.
Thanks for that great intro. Okay, so now we're going to dive into why we called our podcast the Recharge Zone and what exactly is the Recharge Zone. The Recharge Zone tends to be the more frequently mentioned segment, and when people think of the word recharge, you tend to think ample water to the aquifer, or that's where the majority of water in the system is.
But what people may or may not know is that this zone is just one piece of the puzzle, so to speak. There are two more vital zones known as the contributing zone and the artesian zone. Contributing equates to water from rivers, streams, and even runoff flowing over the recharge zone, where the Edwards limestone is exposed at the surface, allowing water to seep into the ground and make its way into the aquifer underground. Then, as pressure builds up, water is extracted from wells or forced to the surface in places like San Marcos Springs and Comal Springs, and the towns of San Marcos and New Braunfels, Texas.
Before we get into the facts, let's tune into our Q&A segment from the Rodeo this past February with one of our interns, Madeline Walshak, to hear if people in our community know that the Edwards Aquifer is the primary source of water for South Central Texas.
Can you describe what an aquifer is? It's our water supply. Do you know what the word splunking means? I don't think I can say that on the air. Do you know the different parts of the Edwards Aquifer? I don't. Please tell me them. Why do you think it's so important to preserve and protect the Edwards Aquifer? Because we need water.
That's true, we do need water.
Yes, and there are many species that live in the Edwards Aquifer that we need to continue to support. What do you think the Edwards Aquifer Authority does? They monitor the aquifer to make sure it's doing okay. I'm sure they take a lot of measurements and all kinds of research.
Yeah, that's exactly what they do. They manage, enhance, and protect the Edwards Aquifer.
Can you describe what an aquifer is?
It's okay, you can. Just
A large underground body of water.
So do you know why the Edwards Aquifer is called the Edwards Aquifer?
Was it found by a guy named Edward?
So do you know what the Edwards Aquifer Authority does?
They preserve the species that are in the water, educate on what the system does for us.
Yeah, no.
They also kind of regulate things that can be built over the recharge zones to protect it.
Yeah, so
Do you know what the different parts of the Edwards Aquifer are?
there's three.
No, I didn't know there were parts.
Zone, is that a part?
Yeah, that is
There you go,
one.
recharge zone.
Let's see, what else could there be? The drainage area?
Yes, great. We got the
The
map
artesian zone?
Perfect, 3 for 3.
I actually knew, now that you say artesian, I remember learning about that in school now.
Yeah.
I just completely forgot
Right
about it
around
until
here.
I heard the word artesian.
Okay, so you just heard from our guest interviewees, visitors at our San Antonio Rodeo booth back in February, their best guesses to some of our aquifer vocabulary. Now Ann-Margaret and I will break it down for you. Okay, Ann-Margaret, so our first word was kind of a funny one that we hear a lot in movies and TV, and it actually, the word means to go caving or caving as a hobby. And actually, cavers around town and throughout the nation, they don't really use that term very often, but it is funny to ask people what it means. Most cavers will just say, hey, let's go caving, or my hobby's caving. They don't really use that term, but that's what it means.
Yeah, I think I've heard it in movies quite a bit, but around the office, I hear the term caving used by the geologists and hydrogeologists.
Yeah, spelunker is like a rookie term that someone who isn't actually a caver will say, hey, I know how to go spelunking, but hey, it's still funny to ask. All right, so the second term, we asked them what an aquifer means, and that means different things to different people. But typically, when we're thinking of an aquifer in technical terms, we're looking for an underground formation of rock that's saturated with water that's accessible to humans. So some groundwater, if it's inaccessible, we can't drill to it, we can't pump it out, that's not technically considered an aquifer.
Oh, fascinating. So when you say accessible, how do you actually access that water?
Well, in regards to the Edwards Aquifer, we have thousands of wells throughout the system. Wells are holes drilled through the rock down into the aquifer where we can install, electric pumps that pump the water back to the surface for human use. San Antonio was actually a pretty small city until they figured out this technology and were able to pump water from the aquifer. And from there on, the city sort of exploded as it had a new resource to develop.
So as soon as people started drilling wells, then there was an absolute need for aquifer protection because wells just started popping up all across our jurisdiction, right?
Yeah, that's right. As soon as they figured it out, people were drilling wells left and right, and there was no regard to how much water they have. It was considered a miracle, basically, that there was this water underground, and it was so easy to get out of the ground. And so it was totally unregulated. People were just pumping as much as they wanted, and even early on, even in the 1800s, they were running into problems where springs were going dry and wells were going dry. So almost immediately, they needed some way to protect both quantity and quality of the water. Okay, and Ann-Margaret, finally, we asked our guest about the zones of the aquifer. Now, this is a tough question, unless you were taught in school, and you notice one of the guests said, hey, I remember I actually learned that back in school. Well, that's because we've been trying to teach it to people for the last, I don't know, 20 years in San Antonio about these zones, because they're actually really important.
So recharge zone. Typically, people tend to know what that actually is, but maybe they don't necessarily know how it's a part of the system. Can you elaborate why so many people know what that is and tend to not know what the other parts are?
You're totally right, Ann-Margaret. Recharge zone is the term that people hear the most. It's on TV a lot on our nightly news. And if you drive anywhere on the north side of town, you'll see these green signs that say entering the Edwards Aquifer Recharge Zone, environmentally sensitive area. They're all over town. I'm sure if you've lived in San Antonio for a while, you've seen them. And you've probably seen a lot of people talking about the importance of protecting, and even the guests mentioned it, protecting development over the recharge zone.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've lived in San Antonio my whole life, and I've definitely seen those recharge zone signs. And whenever I come across them, I tend to think, okay, this must be the most important part of the system, but that's not necessarily true, right?
No, it's definitely an important part, but the three parts all kind of work together. And so the first part is called the contributing zone. And you're not going to see this one on the news, and you're not going to see a giant sign telling you that you're entering the contributing zone, which maybe we should have that. Let me write that down for future ideas because it's super important. The contributing zone actually encompasses almost 5,400 square miles of the Texas Hill Country. It's basically the entire drainage basin for the aquifer. Water that falls there contributing, contributes to creeks and rivers that cross the recharge zone and add tons of recharge, cumulative supply of water to the aquifer every year.
So, does that mean when it rains over the contributing zone, that adds the most amount of water to the aquifer, or can you kind of explain further?
I can explain. It sort of depends on the year. On a really dry year, the contributing zone is perhaps definitely the most important because some of these springs and rivers, they flow year round, even during a drought year. So on a drought year where we're not getting rain in other areas, it may be the only source of recharge for a long period of time entering the aquifer. Think about rivers such as the Frio and the Nueces. The Frio and the Nueces originate in the contributing zone and they lose all or most of their base flow as they cross the recharge zone. So even on a dry year, we at least have that water coming in from the contributing zone, adding to the aquifer. If not for that, we would see greater declines and perhaps spring flow drying up faster without the contributing zone.
Oh, so those rivers contribute water to the Edwards Aquifer.
Absolutely. And sometimes they contribute the majority if we're on a really dry year.
What about the artesian zone?
The artesian zone is actually really fascinating. This is the deepest part of the aquifer. The rocks above the aquifer are less permeable, as are the rocks below the aquifer, so it kind of traps it. We call this a confined system, and that confinement also pressurizes it. So you've heard of artesian springs probably before, or artesian water. Well, we have artesian springs and artesian water right in our backyard because that pressure is hydrologic pressure. It's from the pressure of the rocks above and below the aquifer confining it in place. And so where we have natural faults or fractures, we have water that's being forced up to the surface. And that's the case at springs throughout the region, including at Comal and San Marcos Springs.
That's awesome. And can you explain a little bit about the species that actually live in those springs?
Yes, there are actually a number of species in the artesian zone. There are blind catfish that live way down there, but at the springs themselves, we find species that we see nowhere else on Earth, nowhere else even in Texas, such as the fountain darter, which is a little tiny minnow-looking fish, and we have the Comal Springs riffle beetle, which is a tiny arthropod, a little insect that lives in the springs. It's the size of a little pin dot, and it's found nowhere else on Earth. We even have a certain kind of plant called the Texas wild rice that only grows in the upper reaches of the San Marcos River.
And then also the Texas blind salamander, who happens to be our lovable mascot, Karsten.
Yes, so cute, and you only find them in caves right around San Marcos area.
Wow, it's so fascinating.
It really is fascinating, and these species, they create a unique situation here in South Central Texas. So we're tasked by the Endangered Species Act with protecting both the springs and species, yet we know that we have more than 2 million people that depend on the aquifer. So the real mission of the Edwards Aquifer Authority is to strike a balance between protecting the needs of these species and protecting and supplying the water for all 2 million of us.
That's a huge number. And of those 2 million people, we have municipal users, we have agricultural users, we have people that use wells to get extract water. And what are some of the other kinds of ways that people extract water from the aquifer?
Well, you hit the nail right on the head. We have so many different users. There are municipalities like cities like San Antonio and Uvalde and Hondo. And then we have individual users who live out on ranches and have wells for their domestic needs or wells for livestock. And then we have our irrigators, our great farmers in this area that farm all over the western part and then even in Bexar County and some of the eastern counties as well. So we have various kinds of users. And although the aquifer is very prolific and has a lot of water, if you start slicing that pie up into many different slices, you know, it's actually quite limited, the supply.
And those, like you're saying, those 2 million users actually span across about 8 counties from Uvalde all the way up to Hayes County, right?
That's right, and it's all based on where they're able to drill these wells and get good, clean water. You know, it's interesting, if you look on the old drillers' logs, these are the logs that the drillers keep when they drill wells. As soon as they hit the Edwards water, they'll write sweet on there. I have always found that kind of interesting. They write sweet as they hit the Edwards water because that's the sweetest water around here. That's the good stuff, and that's what they're looking for. And you can kind of see the shape of the aquifer if you just look at the well drilling alone. If you don't look at anything else, if you just look at where the wells are drilled, it kind of outlines where the aquifer is. It's so interesting to me.
And you kind of touched on how the aquifer looks, and that's a part of what we also do. Some of our staff on hand, they actually model, correct?
Yes, we have a series of models that help us make decisions. So models are kind of computer-based programs that can analyze different situations and tell you what the aquifer conditions may be at a given time. So for instance, you can plug in how much pumping you think there's going to be, how much rainfall, how much recharge, and these models will give you a prediction of how much spring flow there'll be, for example, and those given set of conditions. So for a good example is if we have we want to simulate a drought year similar to say 2011, where we had one of the hottest and driest summers on record. Well, you could model that because we know about how much water we're going to use, and we know about how much recharge we can expect. And so that'll tell you what level we think the springs are going to be at.
And that directly reflects in some of the nightly newscasts where they talk about J17 index well, and then also sometimes when people reference J27 index well out in Uvalde, right?
I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of people ask me about that. They see that on the news and like, Brent, what in the heck is this? These numbers they throw at us at the news. Well, that number represents basically the pressure in the aquifer. So it's saying that the aquifer at J17, which is an index well in San Antonio, is at such and such level. And we know based on that level, pretty much how much water is going to be coming out of the springs. So you've heard about drought restrictions before where your water supplier will tell you how often you can water your yard. Well, those those restrictions are triggered by those levels at J17 or at the springs. So if we notice levels in J17 dropping to a point where the spring flow will be impacted, we'll start issuing those drought restrictions.
And that's called critical period management.
Exactly, and those stages are broken down 1 through 5 for San Antonio and these counties, and then 2 through 5 out in Uvalde. And basically that means incrementally greater restrictions on how much water can be pumped out of the ground, all the way up to 44% reduction. So that means almost half of the water we normally use can't be used during a drought, during a severe drought, and that's to protect both the aquifer and the supply.
And the species that rely on those, the water and the amount of water in the aquifer.
Exactly. We're trying to maintain a minimum base flow of water at the springs, even if we have a repeat of the drought of record, which if you remember, it was back in the 1950s. There was basically a 10-year drought that affected the aquifer so badly that Comal Springs, the largest springs in Texas, went dry for a period of 6 months. So if that ever happens again, we're hoping that what we have in place can protect those springs even in those conditions. So Ann-Margaret, going back to our guests at the rodeo, they really weren't too far off on some of their answers, and they obviously understood the importance of the aquifer.
Yeah, I agree, Brent. And that's part of the reason why we do a lot of community outreach and we have various social media platforms is to reach those people and kind of educate them on why it's important to conserve water and why it's important to know about what the Edwards Aquifer supplies for our jurisdiction and the 2 million South Central Texans that rely on the Edwards Aquifer for water.
Absolutely. As you know, I live and breathe this stuff. And when you approached me about this idea of doing a podcast about the aquifer, I was super excited. I listen to podcasts every day on my way to and from work. And so for me to be able to talk about the aquifer in this sense and answer questions from folks and, have people learn more about it, it's just a great idea to me. And I look forward to future episodes and new topics.
All right, y'all. Well, on behalf of my co-host and colleague, Brent Doty, thank you for joining us on the EAA Recharge Zone podcast, and stay tuned for our next episode.